Welcome everyone to the workshop, God Believes in Man, Man Believes in God, God Believes in Man. Today we are with Cardinal Czerny and Austen Ivereigh. Cardinal Czerny is a Jesuit priest. He is Canadian of Czechoslovakian origin. He was ordained in 1973. He founded the Jesuit Forum for Faith and Social Justice in Toronto in 1979. He has always been committed to social justice and has dared to speak out on the fight against AIDS in Africa and on the situation of migrants and refugees. In 2022, he was appointed prefect of the dicastery of the Service of Integral Human Development. With his extensive experience in the fight against poverty, the exodus of refugees and migration, and climate change, he has been closely advising Pope Francis on these issues for several years. His aim is to advocate ecological and social change and climate justice in the church and society, and to help implement them. A man of peace, he was sent by Pope Francis to Ukraine shortly after the outbreak of the war with Cardinal Konrad Krajewski, apostolic chaplain, and a delegation to bring humanitarian aid. Our second speaker, Austen Ivereigh, is a British writer and journalist with a great knowledge of Argentina. Born into a Catholic family, Austen rejected his religious upbringing after his parents divorced, and he was sent to a Benedictine monastery for boarding school. He rediscovered his faith while studying history, and in 1993, after completing his history thesis at Oxford, he spent 4 months with the Benedictines before leaving the monastery, having found his vocation as a writer. He began his career in Peru before returning to England. In 2004, he became the press secretary to the Archbishop of Westminster. It was during this period, with an insider's view of the world of communications within the church, that Austen Ivereigh realized the urgent need for the church to reach out to the laity. I will try to go a little slower, sorry.
You don't need to give all this. Cut it, cut it.
A little shorter.
He's the one that matters.
So Austen Ivereigh, he's the author of...
That's it, just say that.
Of the biography of Pope Francis, as well as the book, How to Defend the Faith Without Raising Your Voice, Civil Responses to the Catholic Hot Button Issues, written in 2012. I'm going to let them speak. Austen Ivereigh will be interviewing Cardinal Czerny, and then there'll be a time of questions and answers. I'll give the voice to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Bonjour, bon dia, buenos dias. It's great to be with you, and thank you for choosing to be here with us. We will be speaking English. I will be speaking British English. The Cardinal will be speaking Canadian English. And since Pentecost, we understand each other perfectly. But I want to begin, before I ask the Cardinal the first question, I'm aware that he is the only one in this room who is wearing a jacket. And I'm going to invite him on behalf of you, if he wants, to take off his jacket to be a bit fresher, if you would like to. If that's okay with you. There we go. He's going to take off his jacket. So, I've known Cardinal Czerny, His Eminence Michael Czerny, for some years, and it's really great for me to have the chance to ask him these questions. And we're going to dig into some big questions this morning facing the world, big challenges that you and we are all facing and asking ourselves what we can do and what we can do to build the kingdom of God in this time. But before we dig into those questions, I want you to get to know Cardinal Czerny a little bit. And so I want to ask you, Your Eminence, if you could just tell us a little bit about your journey into the Vatican. You were a Jesuit priest in Canada, and then you ended up in the Vatican. You've been in the Vatican for many years. How do you go from Canadian Jesuit to working in the Vatican?
Well, I think everyone here knows about the Holy Spirit, so that's the only good answer to your question. No, it's not something that one plans, but I think that, as the introduction said, I've been working in the area of social justice and basically bringing the gospel into public life, and I've been doing that all my life. And Well, one thing led to another. I suppose the most relevant is recently I worked for 8 years in Africa on AIDS. And after that, I was asked by Cardinal Czerny, who was the new prefect, the new president of the Council for Justice and Peace, to come as his kind of advisor or assistant. And that's what I did. And once you're there, I guess accidents can happen.
You never leave. Now, the dicastery which you run, dicastery is a big department in the Vatican, and Cardinal Czerny was appointed full-time to be head of this dicastery from 2022. But this dicastery, this department, used to be called, as you've just heard, the Council for Justice and Peace, and it goes back all the way back to the 1970s. And the new name of the dicastery is the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. Now, those are three very important words because they belong to an important document which you must remember very well from the late 1960s at the time of Pope Paul VI, Populorum Progressio. My question is this: how do you understand integral human development? And does it mean anything different now that you are head of this dicastery than it did back then when you were starting out in your justice and peace work?
Well, of course, I think we all have the experience that ideas or even expressions, I would say, improve over time. And so surely I appreciate it more now than I did 50 or 60 years ago. But I realize that integral human development is not a phrase which we can easily integrate into our faith life, our church life, our missionary life. But if we meditate on it a bit and say, now Jesus said that he came that we might have life and have it to the full, that we might have life and have it in abundance. This was, in a certain sense, translated by Pope Paul VI into integral human development. The words are not as attractive, but if you think about it for a moment, integral human development is exactly what each of us wants for him or herself, and here's the challenge, and cannot enjoy if everyone doesn't have access to integral human development. Now, we could talk for the rest of the day about this, but I'm happy to be able to give, I would say, the original text, that they may have life and have it in abundance, and the contemporary, let's say, public translation, integral human development. And that's one point I would leave, that we could meditate a bit on that and see how it is, in fact, our North Star. It's where we're heading.
It's the basis for human flourishing, isn't it? Which in a way is what Jesus came to bring. When Jesus brought healing and life to people, he was bringing them, I suppose, integral human development.
That's right. The trouble is that most of us come from highly developed, industrialized countries. And so when you say flourishing life, or when I say development, we think of the gross national product and the good life in our societies. And I think we already know that this is a false ideal. So one of the things we need to do is to clarify what we mean by the flourishing of life. What do we mean actually by the life in abundance? And do we realize that honestly, it's inaccessible for me unless I'm concerned that everyone get access.
In a way, it's a common good, isn't it? If everybody doesn't have it, in a way, nobody has it.
Well, that's true, but when you say it as common good, that sounds abstract, and it sounds, to me at least, and philosophical, and then you say, well, let's hope for the best. Yeah. But if I say that each of us cannot fully develop the way God has called us and the way we want to live and fulfill our lives, we cannot aspire to that without taking into account those for whom there are enormous obstacles to integral human development. And before you ask the next question, let me add that some of us come from countries which actually generate or generated and still generate those obstacles. So it's not just an open, innocent question, it's a loaded question.
Now, I ought to explain that as we go on, there'll come a point where I invite questions from you. So feel free at the moment to think about if there are questions arising for you. You know, think about formulating them and how you might ask them.
Objections also are welcome.
And objections and criticisms are also welcome. The Cardinal is delighted with any interaction. Just to go back to you for a moment, between, I think it was 2017 and 2021, you were the number 2 of a section within your department responsible for migration. And the Pope was the head of that section, and you, so therefore that was, your direct boss was the Pope there. And then in 2018, we were all surprised and delighted when the Pope made you a cardinal. And that was a bit of a problem because you weren't a bishop. And I think you were a bishop for a day or something in order to be made a cardinal. The other thing that I remember very much about that moment was you appeared with this pectoral cross. I don't know whether you can see. Most bishops, cardinals, have silver pectoral crosses. This was a very different kind of cross. So can you tell us that story too?
So as you said, Austen, I was one of the 2 people responsible for the section on migrants and refugees. And when I was suddenly named a bishop and a cardinal, a friend mentioned to an artist that I needed a pectoral cross and could they go to a religious goods store and buy one. And the artist said, no, we can't, I'm going to make it. And he went into his storeroom and got a piece of what is called Lampedusa wood. Lampedusa wood is the wood of those old fishing boats that used to leave North Africa, and some would arrive in Italy or Malta, and others would not. So this is the wood of that type, and it, for me, it is a contemporary crucifixion.
And it has a nail in it. Yeah.
Our crosses tend to have nails in them.
So Lampedusa, for those of you who don't know, is a very important, iconic moment in this pontificate when July, just a couple of months after the Pope had been elected, he went to the island of Lampedusa, which is south of Italy, which is a place of, there had been a great tragedy, a shipwreck there, where one of these small boats had capsized. And he went there, the Pope very famously, and issued a cry on behalf of all those migrants who were dying and have continued to die. And in a way, the Pope recently issued a letter, didn't he, commemorating the 10th anniversary of Lampedusa. And actually, it's got worse in many ways since then, hasn't it?
That's right. And he will also go to Marseille, or I should say to France, but specifically to Marseille at the end of September to visit a gathering that the Archbishop there has called of all interested people of the Mediterranean to see how we, Mediterranean citizens and Mediterranean believers, can take responsibility for the massacre that's going on within our, they used to call it lake, our Mediterranean Sea, which should be a sea of life, and in fact it's a watery cemetery.
And the Pope has used very, very strong words. He's talked about it as the Holocaust of our day. He's used very powerful words. Why is it, do you think, that the world here in Europe, the deaths in the Mediterranean, or in the United States, in the deserts of Arizona, why is it, you think, that Western society is able in conscience to allow this to happen? How have we come to this?
I'll try to answer, but let me correct the question. It's not Western society or European society or white society. There are societies all over that are xenophobic, and there are societies all over that are welcoming. So it's not a question of that. Maybe I could go back to my integral human development and say that one of the big confusions that our people have about development, about life, even about prosperity, is that if I share, I'll have less. If I share, I'll have less. We could take a vote here, and a secret vote, of course, ask how many of us believe that if I share what is good, I will have less of it. Well, this is obviously a total heresy, total heresy. But unfortunately, it's very powerful. It's very powerful. And in a time of confusion and puzzling change, as we are living through, people's insecurity drives them into this really absurd idea that what I treasure as mine is more surely mine if I put up walls around it. If what we call gated communities, for me, are a symbol of the madness of this world, of the madness especially of the prosperous world. So, people who come are seen as a threat. And they've come to take away our treasures. They've come to smother our culture. They have come to marry our children. All sorts of things that some people cannot bear to imagine. And unfortunately, our politics has deteriorated to the point where this kind of absurd and cruel nonsense is actually made attractive through the media and through irresponsible communication. And so Mr. and Mrs. whatever country you come from have a tendency or a strong temptation to believe this.
And the irrationality, the craziness of it, is that societies that close themselves off to migrants actually condemn themselves to sterility in the long term. And of course, here in Europe, we have a dramatically falling birth rate. We have an employment problem. There are too many jobs. There are too few people for the jobs that are available. So this is the irrationality that you're talking about. Can I ask you a question, another personal question? I mean, you have a huge brief, a huge responsibility. I mean, you look at the list of things that you're responsible for. It's justice, peace, migration, ecology. What is the most rewarding thing about your role, and what is the most frustrating thing?
Once again, I'll improve on your question before I answer it. What you would normally ask is, among all these many things that you need to do, which is the top priority? That's the usual question. You were too smart to ask it, but I need to answer it because somebody in the room might be thinking that. It's true. If you say integral human development, and if you say, well, what in this world are the obstacles to integral human development, the list unfortunately is endless. And some people will say poverty is the first problem, others will say violence, war, others will say climate change or environmental degradation, others will say xenophobia and those things that we talked about, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, other organizations, for example, the United Nations, can put issues into priority lists, say this is the most important priority. In fact, in a certain sense, it's their job. Whereas our question is not what are the priority issues, but what are the sufferings of God's people. If you want to meditate on this, I recommend the first verse of Gaudium et Spes. The first verse of Gaudium et Spes, where it says that the anxieties and the sufferings, also the joys and the hopes of God's people, especially the poor, are those of the followers of Christ. So our work begins by asking the bishops all over the world, what are the anxieties and the sufferings of your people? Or even more accurately, what are the obstacles to human development in your diocese or in your country? And that's what generates our work. Others generate their work in other ways. Universities work on these things too, but they have a different way of establishing their priorities. So we are trying to respond to the needs of the local church and the church in each country and the church in each continent to accompany their people in seeking integral human development, or even more precisely, to accompany their people in resisting or overcoming the obstacles to integral human development. And now, if he was on target, Austen would ask me, but why have you gotten to so much trouble to say what is the exact expression that you would like everybody to remember? That's a good question, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, so
Yes.
he thinks it's a good question,
Yes.
so now I will try to answer it. Because there's something that has, some mistake that has kind of slipped into our minds, and it doesn't help us to understand what the mission of the church in the world is. And that is that if you'll notice expressions of concern about social justice by the church, you will often see that the church is the subject of the verb of what needs to be done. The church is the subject of the verb of what needs to be achieved. It could give the impression that church needs to lead what is supposed to happen. And this is wrong, wrong, and wrong. This is not what we are called to do. In fact, it's not what Jesus did. He didn't solve people's problems for them. He freed them to live their lives as fully as possible. So, I'm being dogmatic. It's my right as a Vatican representative. I'm being dogmatic about this and plead with you that when you hear about social issues, social concerns, social commitments, watch for the subject of the verb. And to put it very simply, if the subject of the verb is the people, we're on the right track.
Okay, so instead of the church needs to do this or the church should do this in response to this situation, we start with the people are suffering this. And then the question then becomes, how do we respond?
That's right.
Okay.
And so take any example that's of concern to you. One that's very urgent today is climate change. The question that a poor questioner would ask is, what is the church doing about climate change? So we have a sentence which says the church is doing this and that about climate change. And then we would have to say to the journalist, no, you can't ask that question. You should ask, how is the church trying to help God's people to face climate change?
Okay.
Is that clear enough?
That's very good, but I'm not going to let you get away with not answering my question about...
They're on my side.
I know
See,
that.
they're
Of course
on my
they are.
side.
Of course they are. No, but my question also is about what do you find most rewarding and what do you find most challenging or frustrating in your role?
Well, I think I'm too diplomatic to answer the second half of the question, but I'm very happy to answer the first. In the year and a half that we've been working and trying to do what I'm trying to share with you, in other words, listen to the bishops and hear what they carry with them as the anxieties and the sufferings of their people, my greatest satisfaction is when they, practically with tears in their eyes, say, thank you for listening, thank you for trying to understand, thank you for offering to help, not to solve the problem, but to help us to help our people to solve the problem. That is very, and honestly, it doesn't happen every day, but we are beginning to get testimonies from bishops in that way. And I know that Austen wants to ask, but what do you really mean about bishops? Because you would think that is a bit narrow for...
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask.
You see, he's so good. He's so good. So we use the word bishops for everyone in the church, the diocese, let's say, who is somehow busy with these problems of integral human development. So, typically, a bishop may have an assistant for social issues, for justice and peace. He often has a caritas in his diocese. He might even have a working group on a particular issue that's of real concern. But then there are also other groups who are working in the same direction, religious congregations, Catholic NGOs, Caritas again. And finally, not to leave out the journalists, we also include the Catholic journalists and the journalists who report sympathetically about this, because we believe that communication of what we're sharing today is very, 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 that's fine, important.
Yeah. And part of your role, of course, and part of the Pope's role is to raise in the media, to bring to public attention the kind of suffering which is often ignored in the mainstream news, like the suffering of migrants in refugee camps, for example. The Pope talks about this as not an era of change, but a change of era. And I hope you see the difference. Every era is an era of change, but there are some eras or epochs where change happens very quickly, and it feels like we're moving from one stage of history to another. And that was the diagnosis that the Latin American Church made back in 2007 at a big conference which Pope Francis was at, and he was very much influenced by, where, for example, the ecological question surfaced for him in a very real way.
For the first time.
For the first time. He says he was converted. He listened to all the bishops talking about what was happening in Amazonia, and he thought, oh, what is this? This has got nothing to do with
Argentina.
With Argentina. But then he began to see that this really is a massive issue. And so this idea of a change of era, how do you perceive this? Because I'm just aware in your life, you've been in this for so many decades. How do you perceive, how do you explain to people who are in their 20s, who don't know previous eras, what this change of era is like? What's going on? What's happening in this time?
Actually, I think the best way to try to explain it is to ask, what is your experience of change? Or if you want to look at the dial in the car, the
Speedometer.
The speedometer, say, how fast do you actually think we are going? Because to answer your question fully, we can only answer it looking back. But the starting point for, especially for younger people, is what they're experiencing. And that's what I would like to ask, and maybe somebody will answer, will suggest what it feels like, how it works on you, the speed with which you perceive and you experience that things are moving and things are changing. And I might even add, things are deteriorating.
And Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, a document that you were very involved with, that human life is grounded in three fundamental and closely interrelated relationships: with God, with creation, and with our fellow human creatures. And of course, any previous Pope church teaching would have talked about the first and the third of those, but it was Francis who famously, in this encyclical of 2015, Laudato Si, which certainly has changed my life in many ways, was a groundbreaking document, introduced this second element. You were very involved from the beginning with that document. What was it like for you now to have this whole, it's a kind of new agenda, it felt anyway, that suddenly the church needed to be engaged in what was going wrong with our relationship with the created world, which is really what Laudato Si sets out to answer. What did it feel like to develop that teaching at that time?
You know, on the one hand, some of you can even look back to 2015. At that time, it seemed to be already so obvious that we were heading towards disaster. And in fact, it is in 2015 that the famous Paris conference was held and the agreement was signed. So in one sense, the point wasn't exactly, you might say, naming the issue. Rather, I think it was helping us as God's people to situate the issue within our faith life and our church life. To help all of us to avoid thinking, well, of course I live my faith very intensely, and and there are other people who are really upset about the climate. Well, that won't do. That won't do. And I think this, and maybe it comes partly from our need to enrich our spirituality so that it embraces more than just, let's say, our feelings or our intimate relationships or our worshiping community and so on. So while it's true that in a sense Laudato Si was trying to be kind of an agenda setter, or maybe better an agenda resetter, because the world agenda was going badly wrong. But in fact, it also was doing something which I've already suggested is very important, is to raise the awareness and make possible the involvement of each member of God's people, each one of us. That this, again, is not something that the UN will take care of, and it's not something that the Vatican will take care of, but it is something that we need to take care of, and therefore our respective government needs to take care of. And many of us had given up on these ideas.
I think many of us feel powerless faced with the massive challenge. We know it's not going well. In Paris, they agreed to 1.5 degrees. That is not going to be reached, that goal. Many of us feel very angry and very powerless. Where do you think you as young people, where can young people begin? Because one of the beautiful things about Laudato Si is it talks about the way we relate to creation itself. And of course, most of us live indoors most of the day. We spend time on our screens. We go from office to supermarket. We live in a world where everything seems to be available to be consumed recklessly. Where do we begin? Where would you say that somebody who says, I feel the need of an ecological conversion in me, where can I begin? Spiritually, in my daily life?
Well, the first and most honest answer is I don't know. I think that should be clear. One of the ways that I feel helps is to bring your huge question, and in this assembly, to say that we need a conversion is a very loaded word. That's no simple thing, like what am I going to have for lunch? No. So if you say conversion and you mean conversion, that's not something which I can plan. It's something I can pray for, but I can't plan it, and I'll probably know about it once it happens. So that would be my maybe strongest answer to the question. The second one is to reduce the anxiety. In a certain sense, the way you posed the problem or the challenge was, what can I, little me, do about worldwide climate change? And by the time I'm finished the question, I'm completely paralyzed. Completely paralyzed. So that's not the good question to ask. The good question is to ask, and ask the Lord to reveal to me, the gift of the Holy Spirit, is what's the next step that I can take in response to what Pope Francis said in Laudato Si? What's the next step that I can take? don't start by telling other people what to do. Start by asking, what's the next step that I can take? And the sooner you do that, the sooner you will ask the question again. And you need to keep asking the question over and over and over again. Each day, if you want even each hour, you can ask yourself, what is the next step? And the Holy Spirit will guide you, and you will become an effective struggler with regard to this issue. Good. And I think it will also nourish your faith life, because you will recognize how God is at work in your life to help us all to rescue or to save or to care for our common home.
To me, the conversion is so much about the way we respond to the created world, whether we want to use it, grasp it, consume it, or whether we have another kind of a relationship with it, which is beautifully described in the last part of Laudato Si. I just wonder whether there are any questions already on people's minds. Does anybody have a question? You're very welcome to put up your hand if you've got a question, and a microphone will come to you. If not, we'll carry on. Are there any questions? Yes, I can see some. Yes, let's take 2 questions, please. 2 questions.
Also in French. It can be in French also.
And it can be in French. Si vous voulez faire la demande en français, ça va.
Au portugais.
Au português também se pode. Au espanhol.
Au italien.
Au italien.
Au canadien.
Okay, let's take a couple of questions.
I'm here.
Oh, very good, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting, and it's actually responding to many of my questions. I was asking just myself, what you said was so true to me, and I feel like everyone is kind of touched by this. But I'm just asking myself the churches in the towns and everywhere around the world are not really telling the same story as you are. So I'm just wondering how this message, which is it seems like very close to the Pope, but not really in the communities that we are living. And so I'm just wondering how this big word from the top will transcend down to the other churches and can really impact us, because me as a young person, it's the first time I feel like I've heard this truth, and in my church or around me, on many other people that are in churches, just what I'm feeling, are not telling the same things. So
right. So you're on the ecological question.
Yes.
You're frustrated
yes.
that parishes haven't heard the message. Thank you for that. And another question.
Hello, Your Eminence. When war in Ukraine was started, you went with Cardinal Krajewski there to be a Pope's voice for these poor people. Yes, I am a deacon from Poland, and please tell us, if you can, what Vatican is doing now for end this war and don't let to win Russia.
Thank you very much. 2 questions for you.
Regarding the first and very important question, because it was another way of asking, how can I take my first next step if I feel discouraged by the church around me? One step which Austen could have suggested if he was allowed to answer the question is to inform yourself. It's quite likely that your church, quite locally and certainly more broadly, is doing, in a sense, exactly what you think it should do and would want to do. But the media don't communicate this because it's good news about the Catholic Church, and I don't have to explain more. So, before you make the question too difficult, see whether you shouldn't first look for evidence. And you might find, I think you will find, in short order, you will find enormously encouraging and inspiring stories of what your church, what our church, is actually doing. And remember, it's not our job to save the climate. It's our job to encourage and accompany God's people in facing the issues of the climate. So, if we have time for a quick example.
Sure.
You might be upset because your parish priest has not put solar panels on the parish church. And you're right, it's money is being spent on other things. Why can't we have solar panels on the church? But that's a very restricted thing compared with, for example, recognizing that where you live, actually the water is deteriorating more and more, and that the poorer people can't afford good or decent drinking water. That's as much of a challenge, I think, maybe even more of a challenge than how much electricity the church is using to keep its building warm or cold or whatever. So I would really encourage you to, as part of your first, or maybe even before you decide on your first step, is ask around a bit, and you will find, I promise that you will find quickly examples that will bring tears to your eyes and will warm your heart and will, most importantly, give energy to your feet so that you can go and help.
So almost start. Where is the suffering, like you were saying earlier? Start with the pain, start with the suffering.
Well, no, but the question wasn't asking about where's the pain. The question was asking where the response is.
Right.
I'm saying that they're probably very near to you, but you're not hearing about them. But I'm also saying that notice how you're asking the question. And again, do you expect your church to become like a green army that goes in and destroys the ecological enemies?
Right.
Not a great image. Don't quote me on this one, please.
By the way, one quick tip. There is a wonderful film made with the cooperation of the dicastery and the Laudato Si movement. It's called The Letter. It's available on YouTube for free. You can organize a showing in your parish, a very powerful, powerful introduction to the question of Laudato Si. So now the other question, Ukraine, you were there with Cardinal Czerny.
So maybe I could first say that my mission there was very simple. It was the first days of the war, and the Pope, the Holy Father, wanted his concern, his sympathy, his solidarity, his anguish to be communicated tangibly to the people of Ukraine and to the people of the surrounding countries who were receiving unprecedented numbers of refugees already in the first week or two. So I didn't have anything to do. I just needed to go there, and people recognized right away why I was there and what I was trying to say. It reminds me of the famous expression of St. Francis of Assisi. In everything you do, preach the gospel and, if necessary, use words. Well, I didn't have to use words. I simply communicated this or I embodied, if you like, this important gesture of solidarity and of sympathy of the Holy Father. If you know about the Jesuits, you will say that my answer to the other part of your question is very Jesuitical, but I can't resist because it's the only answer I can give. If you ask me what the Vatican is doing, that was the question, wasn't it? What is the Vatican doing in response to this war? Is that right?
Yeah.
One answer is that whatever you know from the media is what they're doing. But if you answer me and say, I know what the media is saying, and it doesn't look very good, and I'm not very happy with the answer, so what is the Vatican really doing? And I will say, my dear friend, if I tell you what the Vatican is doing, don't believe me, because I can't talk about it in public. In fact, I can't even talk it in private. On the other hand, if I knew exactly what the Vatican was doing, I couldn't say it, because to say it would be to spoil it. So while you appreciate the public gestures, the solidarity, the aid, the encouragement to welcome the refugees, and even something as public as Cardinal Zuppi's shuttle diplomacy, all of that is an answer to your question, but you didn't need me to tell you, because it's in the public sphere. If you want to be concerned about what the Vatican is really doing, please pray for Pope Francis, as he always asks, and pray for those in the Vatican who are responsible for continually monitoring the situation and seeking possible, somewhat promising, slightly promising opportunities to respond. But the real answer to your real question, by definition, I cannot give.
Just to explain for those people who don't know, the Cardinal mentioned Cardinal Zuppi, who is the Pope's special envoy, who has been going to Moscow and Kiev and Washington and other places. And I mean, I think there's no secret here. What the Vatican is looking for is any opportunity to bring the two sides together, to have any kind of discussion about prisoners, about something that enables a dialogue to begin. The Vatican's really good at looking for those and finding those spaces. But of course, it all has to happen mostly below the radar. Can I just ask you on the question of the war? Fratellituti, which is the document we haven't yet discussed, came out in 2020, the document on fraternity. The Pope talks there about war in a way that suggests that war is never just or even justified. But on the other hand, he says that Ukraine has the right to defend itself against an aggressor. How do we reconcile those two things?
Well, if I bring the question home, if you're really concerned about something and the other person doesn't agree with you, is it just, is it legitimate to punch him in the face until he changes his mind? The answer is no, it's not. If somebody, for whatever reason, punches you in the face, the automatic reaction is to punch back. And that's not ideal. Jesus doesn't recommend that. But to put up your hands to protect your face, to back off, to run, to even try to trick your aggressor into not beating you up anymore, all of that is legitimate. And I think you see right away why. So I mean, I should have started by saying that this is a very difficult and a very emotional issue. And it's obviously most emotional when you happen to belong to a nation that is being aggressed. Finally, I will not be able to give you a satisfactory political or philosophical answer because Jesus's advice and example of turning the other cheek is way, way, way beyond human ability. Way beyond us. It's absolutely unreachable with our strengths and weaknesses alone. So you are pushing what seems to be like a public political discussion to a level of spiritual and human commitment that's completely beyond it. Having said that, I think that everybody can understand the difference between waging war and defending yourself. And maybe that's a challenge for the Ukrainians also. While they have begun by defending themselves, are they tempted, in fact, to go to war? I think they would say they haven't gone to war, but I don't know if they use that language. But I think we can understand that as a way of trying to understand what is happening and what options they have, and how, as Christians, but also as citizens, we regard all this. Let's be clear. I think the majority of people in this room live within the European Union. You used to, but I still do.
It's a difficult topic.
Yeah,
It's a sensitive
I don't
topic.
want to make him.
I'm a proud European, let's put it that way.
He used to be a proud European.
No, I am a proud European.
He's an ex-European.
My country was taken out of the EU, but anyway, go on.
We'll leave him. We'll pray for him, but we'll leave him in peace. My dear brothers and sisters of the European Union, we are not, we cannot be, we have no right to be observers of this war. We are part of this war. And I wish so much that everyone would take on awareness and then responsibility for this war to which we are a party. Now, I won't go further because if you understand me, I'm glad I said it. And if you don't, somebody will explain it to you. But we cannot talk about this war as if we were somewhere else. We are in it. And it would be very helpful if we understood why we're in it, what we're doing in it, what we expect to get out of it, and what we're ready to sacrifice in order not to pay too much or to suffer too much. End of story. I'm very sorry, but that's how it is.
This is a war in Europe, and it involves the two world's nuclear powers. Other questions, please? Over there, yeah, thank you. Yeah, over there. Can we have the microphone? Oh, there you're there.
Good morning, Your Eminence. My name is Jason. I come from Canada.
It's okay, 11:30.
I come from Canada, working with Development and Peace Caritas Canada. So we bring greetings from Canada to you. We're very thankful that you're here with us in Portimao. My question has to go along with Catholic social teaching. So perhaps from some of the young people here in this room, some of us have heard about Catholic social teaching. Some of us, it's probably a new concept. But it is one of the best kept secrets of the Church when it comes to responding to social issues. One of the things that I've always struggled with was this spectrum of liberal versus conservative, Republican, etc., because there seems to be a lot of political or ideological divide between young people as to what our approaches should be when it comes to responding with a heart of social concern. And so I found that Catholic social teaching was neither liberal nor conservative or whatever, but it always remained to be true to what Jesus told us, to have a heart for social concern. Can you share with us very briefly in a few seconds, for those who do not know, what is Catholic social teaching and how can that inspire us, regardless of ideological or political stance, to respond to social concern in our world at a local, at a community, national, and at an international level as well?
Thank you.
We could take the rest of the week on that one, but it helps to ask yourself a similar question to see how you answer it. So how do you live out the gospel in your personal life? How do you live out the gospel in your interpersonal life, family, school, community? And how do you live out the gospel as a public person, as a citizen? So the name is a bit frightening because we don't say Catholic personal doctrine or Catholic family doctrine. We don't use those heavy words for what is the living out of our faith in the various more intimate or nearer relationships of our lives. And it would be astonishing if the gospel, if it really is the good news for everyone about life to the full, that this would not be lived in public, in our public lives. So I think the puzzle is more about who and what and how am I in my public life, or in our public life. And then, logically, there's then the other areas you say, and how does the gospel make that what it should be for me and for us?
Thank you. Another question, please. Over here. Yeah, thank you.
Hi,
Yeah.
thank you for the workshop. We know that nowadays one of the most the main reason of the climate change is the style of living, capitalism, consumerism, the structure of our modern and global life. So how can the church can be a place to bring these subjects and to make us to reflect about the subjects through the example of Jesus Christ, and to try to, in your daily life, think about the regeneration of life, and think about more and act to the community, collective, modern problems, environmental and social. Thank you.
So that's a very good question. I think it's on many people's minds in this assembly and elsewhere. And I think my earlier answer about the first step or your first step is still the most realistic answer to your question. Because if I give a big answer to your big question, we will all be paralyzed. We will all say, oh, it's a terrible problem, and what can I possibly contribute to such a high-level and complicated problem? Whereas, if you start from the other way around and say, climate change is a real threat to me, to my family, to my future family, to all future generations, and then especially to the poor, what is the first thing I can do? And how can Jesus help me to accept my co-responsibility for this catastrophe? My co-responsibility. I know you didn't do anything, or maybe you did, to make this worse. Depends on how much plastic you throw away and so on. But anyway, we won't go into that. You can learn about the origins of the climate crisis. That's one way to help you to understand. But I think the important thing is to ask the question in such a way that you can give an answer. Not the UN, not the World Bank, not even the government of France or whatever. You. And I know that if you are faithful to the first step, the second step, and the third step, one day the effect of what you have done and your companions have done will also change the United Nations, the World Bank, and the government of France, or whatever country is necessary.
Thank you. Another question. I'm not sure where the microphone is, so whoever gets the microphone, ask.
Hi,
Oh,
here it is.
There you are. Very good.
Yeah. Good morning, Eminence. Thank you so much for your presence here with us. I think there is a notion about church that must be a bit clarified. The church is certainly here, us, the people of God. But it's also an institution. It's also the Vatican. And maybe I would like you to clarify this dual signification. Maybe about us as the people of God. What can we do for human development, and how we can maybe, can you tell us a bit, maybe the Catholic, the Christian DNA, how we can really develop in meeting the poorer, meeting the other? Maybe on the other side, on the institutional level, isn't it something that you can tell us about a general speech like structures of sins, or even the technocratic paradigm? Something that really actually is bigger than just us, the people, and a point of view that the institution of the church can develop. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Maybe to focus on the last part, which was, I think, the most of concern to many of us, about helpful expressions like the technocratic paradigm. These ideas like that, or the consumerism, these are more useful for reflecting on our behavior and on our experience than they are for planning our responses. So I would say that something like the technocratic paradigm belongs more in our examination of conscience. It helps us to discover how, even though we talk about the Green Revolution and we're happy to be supporters of it, that in fact in our daily lives we are making options that go exactly in the opposite direction. That if we say, I see in my own life, I see the effects of the technocratic paradigm. And the same with consumerism, and the same with the other big words for the big challenges. I say it not to make everything personal and small scale, but rather, and this is Pope Francis's way of approaching it, but rather to say that abstractions are paralyzing. Abstractions are useful for clarifying reality, but they're not useful for responding. That's a terrible generalization. Maybe I will regret saying it, but I think it's very true. And so if you are worried about things like that, I would say do what Pope Francis says, is start by listening, and start by listening to the poor. And if all of this is because you are worried about yourself, well, the poor, the cry of the poor will help you to stop worrying about yourself and start grasping the problems in the way that they are actually playing out. And the Lord will call you, and the Holy Spirit will guide you to respond. yes, use these important ideas, these important challenges as a way of staying informed and by understanding the bigger picture. But don't, I suggest that you not imagine that they will do what you asked me, which is that they will somehow clarify what we should do or how we should behave or even how we should think or how we should pray. They don't do that well. In fact, they block it. So that's a...
Would you recommend the 3-step: contemplate, discern, propose, see, judge, act? In other words, first look, then take time to say, where is the Spirit speaking to me in this, and what can I do? Almost so you don't stay with the analysis, which can be very paralyzing.
Yes, this is a teaching, a discovery of the church and a teaching of the church in the last 70 or 80 years, that this simple looking and simple sounding formula or recipe, see, judge, and act, is inevitably very useful, and I would say nearly always brings us to the better answer. And the most difficult step is the first one. The most difficult step is the first one. Try it, and you will, and if you reflect, you will see how difficult it is to listen, how difficult it is not to talk, how difficult it is to listen without being distracted, how difficult it is to listen without already judging the other one. And if the person we're listening is not our chum, someone that we grew up with and we know so well, and who in fact shares our prejudices, sooner or later we're going to have trouble listening.
Okay.
And then you need to listen some more.
Thank you. So we're going to take a question. We've got a question here, yeah. We'll take that question and maybe one more, and then we're going to, I'll ask a question and we'll wrap up. Thank you. If you could keep the questions short,
Yes,
that would
sure.
be helpful. Yeah, yeah.
La question du changement climatique est devenue prégnante aujourd'hui.
Donc, the question of climate change is really important today.
À la suite des recommandations émises par le GIEC, la pression sociale et politique, elle monte, ça crée beaucoup d'angoisse, des peurs.
After the report of IPCC, thank you.
Yep.
After the IPCC report, with the political pressure that's growing,
Il me semble que ça va bien au-delà de l'esprit de Laudato Si, des questions de pollution, du respect de la création et du respect humain.
that's even greater than the questions that were posed in Laudato Si about pollution, respect of the human person, etc.
À côté de cela, l'Église a un grand respect pour les savoirs scientifiques, pour la vérité scientifique.
At the same time, the church has a great respect for science, for scientific knowledge.
Et je voudrais savoir si, dans cette question climatique, l'Église s'appuie sur des savoirs indépendants, c'est-à-dire indépendants du GIEC, qui est une entité politique.
And so my question is, in questions like this, does the church also base itself on independent sources, for example, the IPCC?
Whatever you want.
Actuellement, quelqu'un qui veut discuter de l'origine du changement climatique est regardé comme quelqu'un de une sorte de non-croyant, alors qu'il est un chercheur de vérité.
Today, someone who wants to ask the question, what is the origin of climate change, can be seen as someone who is an unbeliever.
Voilà, ma question porte sur l'indépendance de l'Église, sa position sur ce débat scientifique et l'indépendance par rapport aux entités politiques.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask the question of the relationship with the church, with science.
Okay, got it.
Thank you.
Got it, thanks. Can we have another question as well before Cardinal answers?
On a parlé de différents problèmes sociaux, le changement climatique, les questions migratoires.
So we talked about different social issues, climate change, migration.
Mais il me semble qu'on en a oublié une,
But I think we forgot one.
notamment dans l'Occident, et ça tend à se propager, l'idéologie wokiste Et cette idée de mettre la liberté au-dessus de la morale, ou en tout cas de la déformer,
I'm talking about wokeism, which, especially in the Western world, can place freedom above morality.
ma question est très simple. Comment l'Église se positionne sur cette question qui tend à bouleverser nos rapports sociaux?
So my question is, what is the church's position in relationship with the subject that can
Okay.
change
Okay.
our relationship?
Got it. And we'll just take one more question as well. But if you could keep it brief.
I'll keep it short.
Thanks.
Thank you, Cardinal. I'm not French, but I like to watch the news in France. And for the last couple of years, there is a new term which is quite polemical, which has emerged. And that term is le grand remplacement. I think in English, the great replacement. And I think I see that amongst the younger generation, and especially the younger Catholics, and it's quite a present concern. What does the Church think about it, and the Pope? Because we don't really talk about it
Do you want
out
that
of
explained?
France.
Do you want the Great Replacement explained? Can you briefly summarize the Great Replacement theory?
Well, I'm not an expert,
just
but
briefly.
I think it's just the replacement of one population by another, mainly due to immigration.
Right. This is the fearful theory that, okay.
Yes,
right,
and
okay.
it's basically cultural.
Based on fear. Okay, thank you. So those three questions, can you remember them, Cardinal?
I'll try.
Yeah, sorry,
Let me start with the last one.
Start with the last one, yeah.
My feeling is that something like the Great Replacement is more of a fear than a description, much less a forecast or a prophecy. It's a fear, and it's based on many factors, which in a good discussion we would want to know. What motivates people to believe in or to promote something like that? In my opinion, it's also based on a real ignorance of human and cultural history. I don't know. Thank you for the support. I was going to say that I don't know of any society which has benefited by somehow not opening itself to others. It's a part. It's like migration. Migration is not a problem. It's a part of life, and one of the effects of migration is to enrich the receiving culture. And there's thousands of examples each one could give of how what we call our culture has been enriched by the arrival of others. So why this should suddenly stop with the arrivals of these ones?
And then the first question was about science, church and science.
Well, I think we've touched on an important point already once or twice. Which is, what do you mean by church in this case? And we appreciate that the word means different things. I think when the question was asked, it seemed that church and Vatican were equivalent. But in order to understand, to appreciate the challenge of a question like that, I think it's very important to say, well, who are we talking about in the church? Are we talking about our local Christian community? Are we talking about our parish, our diocese, our bishops' conference? Are we talking about the Holy See, the official teaching, or the work of a department like mine, which works on issues, but is not necessarily always declaring Vatican policy? So not to try to avoid the question, but to encourage that when we ask questions like that, let's also identify the appropriate Catholic partner in that dialogue who can help us to see what is the Catholic response. For example, on climate change, we know there's a whole lot of controversy, and so I don't know how we could expect the Church to have a single monolithic position. But if you ask a bishop, he will give one kind of answer. If you ask a Catholic journalist, I don't think he will disagree with the bishop, but it will be a different kind of answer. If you ask a Catholic scientist, you will get a certain kind of answer. And if you ask the Catholic head of a big multinational mining company, you might well get another answer.
And the second question was about wokeism. And the particular question was, how do we, I think it was, how do we respond to the assertion of individual freedom of choice about identity and all that kind of thing over morality? I've understood the question correctly. But I mean, just in general, how do you see wokeism as a problem, as a threat, or how do you see wokeism?
We don't have. I don't think we have it in Italian. And so
wokismo. I suppose it's political correctness. It's gender ideology would presumably be part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think. I hope you're not going to get tired of the same answer to different questions. But I think the approach to a question like that is, first of all, to be clear, at what level are you asking? One would be, let's say, in the media, what you could call the level of some kind of public exchange, if not a dialogue or discourse. And you say, well, what is the role of wokeism, or how does wokeism play itself out in public discourse in my country or in your country or somewhere else? And if that's what's going on, how can the church in that country make a contribution? I don't think we can ever say we're going to solve it, but maybe we could make a contribution. If you go to the other extreme and say, I'm asking about wokeism because I see its damaging effect on my life. I see it damaging my attitudes. I see it damaging my relationships. I see it damaging how I even pray or share or worship. Well, that's quite a different question, and one that requires a quite different kind of answer. So this would be one way. One way of dealing with these huge, once again, abstractions. My suggestion is identify the levels of reality which are involved. Try to answer or give a proposal at the appropriate level, but then ask yourself, again, if it's a problem, and what might be my next step? What would the Lord want me to do about this?
Thank you. Well, there's huge wisdom in what we've heard from you today, not just on the great issues of the day, but how we approach them personally as people of faith, building the kingdom of God in this time of change, this change of era. I'm going to reserve to myself the last question, and then we'll finish. Today, this last day of Welcome to Paradise is all about hearing the Spirit, listening to the Spirit, and responding to the Spirit, and going out and evangelizing. And this is the pontificate, of course, which is all about the church that goes out, that's missionary. You are a missionary, you are a Jesuit. To me, there's a great tragedy in separating the struggle for justice and dignity, human dignity, the kingdom of God, from evangelization. But so often the church separates these two. A message to everybody here today: how can we better integrate the search for the kingdom of God in our time, justice, peace, dignity, with the task of evangelization, which Jesus also asks us to do?
Well, I think the first answer is the very concrete one, which is to listen. And if I only listen to my people, to my circle, well, then that's not really listening. That's just mutual reinforcing. So am I listening beyond my little world? And am I listening to the poor, or only to people whom are as comfortable or more comfortable than I am? So that would be one answer, one response to a possible false separation between evangelization, living and bringing the gospel to everyone, and the sufferings, anxieties, frustrations, tragedies of God's people, especially the poor, to which the church is dedicated to helping with, or at least to accompanying the effort of the people to overcome these things. So I feel that maybe what I already once asked, whether if you reflect on how you try to live the gospel in your so-called private life, school life, community life, work life, and I think you wouldn't be here today if you were not keen on doing that, or at least anxious to find out how to do that, then ask, and you get some sense of how the Spirit is guiding you to live out the gospel in these very important areas close to your life. Then please ask with the same concern and the same openness and the same generosity of spirit to the question, and how is the Holy Spirit asking me or us to bring the gospel to society, to the public, to public life? Personally, I cannot imagine that somebody would say, well, the second question is illegitimate. Jesus didn't come to change society. Jesus came to choose hearts. I would just give up. No, I wouldn't give up, because please remember, maybe this is the best lesson to take away. Listen, 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 and when it hurts, listen some more. It sounds simplistic, but it is one of the most important first steps in facing any of the challenges of being a human being, of being a citizen, of being a believer, of being a Christian, of being a Catholic.
Cardinal Michael Czerny, thank you very much.
You can say that good questions generate good answers.
And yeah, very good. And you'll be hearing from the Cardinal again in half an hour, because we gather again for Mass here, which he will be celebrating. So thank you all for taking part. Thank you for the questions, and have a good day.